yeah, so he wrote them down, he nailed them on a church door, but then somebody else scribbled them and copied them, and then it went into the printing press, which had conveniently been invented about 67 years earlier or something like that, right? By a guy in the same country, Gutenberg, right? And what that meant, and that here you see actually a print of the 95 Theses from the same year, right? I mean, for the time, the 16th century, that was an astonishing speed. And that resulted in one thing: the end of the Catholic Church as the only Christian church, right? Well, not entirely true. I mean, there was always the, Eastern churches, right? So, but I mean, it resulted in Reformation, right? But it's interesting to understand there was a very similar guy to Martin Luther, Jan Hus, about a century earlier. You know what happened to Jan Hus? Well, the Roman Church invited him to a meeting and then burned him on the stake, right? So to a certain degree, the difference between Jan Hus and Martin Luther is media technology. Because with Jan Hus, they could still contain the message. With Luther, after 2 weeks, it was known in all German-speaking lands, thanks to the printing press, right? That's new media impact. So it can be disruptive, but we also need to realize there's nothing inherently disruptive versus the existing order. It might also that the existing order becomes very adept in using the new media, right? It's not automatically something that is there for disrupting existing things. And, so I mean, one thing that I find interesting, so if you read about TV history, for example, in this country, you probably read that the BBC started the first TV broadcasts in 1936 or 37, right? You find that in a lot of US media history books. Unfortunately, it's not true. There were some other guys who started a regular broadcasting TV service before. We might not want to talk about them, but it was Nazi Germany who started the first TV news broadcast in 1934. So a couple years before the BBC, right? So that also alerts us to, is TV democratic? Yes, it has democratic potential. But, dictatorships might just be as well, adapt to using that, right? Okay, so there can be considerable disruptive societal effects from new media, right? And when there's sort of this new media comes, old media is completely replaced. Has been claimed so many times, never happened, right? I mean, there was honestly a time when I thought I had to buy my last record player and really invest into a record player so it will last. Vinyl is everywhere. I even hear the compact cassette is coming back. What a stupid idea. Nobody needs that shit, trust me. Right? So, right? But so it never, new media never fully replaces old media. The radio is still around. TV has not replaced the cinema. We can go on, right? I mean, the market share might become much, much smaller, right? But similarly, I think there might be a market in the future for handcrafted video games with no AI, right? That might even be part of the PR material, and people might buy a game because of that. Right? So AI-less game design will not disappear. Right? To make that very concrete here. But there will be jobs. So jobs will be lost. Right? I think especially right now when I see our students at my institution who want to become game artists, I'm really concerned. Right? I mean, it's probably not completely there yet. but that's not really the question. Will there still be game artists in a game studio? Yes, but it will be less, and their job will be more like overseeing the GenAI process. And I mean, if you think of a printing press, I mean, scribe is not a job anymore, which you can make a living, and it used to be a job for thousands of years. Right? There were long family tradition of being scribes. It was wiped out. So that's just happening. And then another interesting thing to observe, and it happens with different speeds, but very often the technology is first, and artistic use of it is later. You can see that very clearly with the invention of the printing press, which came about 1440. It took 160 years basically until the first modern novel, right? Don Quixote, right? And so it took a long while until writers really understood, you know, the advantages of this thing and how they could use this new printing form for a long-form novel as we understand it today. And in this regard, I also find it very interesting what Don Quixote is about. It's about the dangers of reading, right? So the guy reads so many, you know, knights things or, you know, stories about knight that he thinks he is a knight. He enters this universe of the book, right? The fictitious reality, and he cannot get out of it anymore. And that's the first novel, about the dangers of getting lost in a fictitious world created by writing, right? Interesting to think about. But similarly, I think we can make the claim that advances in AI have surpassed the AI being used in games in general for quite a while, right? I was actually the external examiner on a PhD thesis sort of a couple of weeks ago, and makes exactly the claim that this thesis has been making. And I'll give you a link to it later, or show you later more from it. But in a sense, there is a bit of a catching up between where AI is and where the use of AI in games is. There are more opportunities to embrace there, all right? But that's also kind of normal, as we see from my example here. All right, so why am I talking about these internal laws, all right? Because I think the concern that we have this new media moment is not new. It has happened before with the introduction of the printing press, of the radio, of TV, of the cinema. And if we know that, we understand that we can learn from these prior transitions. Right, so talking about AI in games. Quick question, when was the first AI-based game? Rogue, that would be 1980. Okay, not bad. Okay. Eliza, that's 1966. Okay, also not bad. Well, it depends how you see it. I mean, at least it's a chatbot, and for people like me in interactive narrative, we see it as sort of a first interactive narrative. Okay. Yes, okay, all right. So, we'll come back to it, right? But, I mean, let's get at it from a little bit of a different angle, right? So we should also understand that there's always hype about AI being new, right? AI isn't new, right? It's an idea that people have worked on, especially generations of computer scientists, for 70 years almost, right? I mean, with the term being coined in 1956 at a conference at Dartmouth College, right? So AI is older than I think anybody in the room here. If we think conceptually, we might trace it back even earlier to ideas that Roosevelt's science advisor Vannevar Bush had, right? In a famous article, As We May Think, published in 1945, right? And as we see, we can even get way further back, right? So we're seeing the results of a multi-generation effort that now becomes ripe for using it for sort of more average people in a sense, right? And here's an interesting prediction made by Konrad Zuse in 1938. In 50 years, a calculating machine will defeat the world chess champion. He was off by 9 years. Right? So, if you never heard about Konrad Zuse, he invented the first Turing-complete computer in 1941. Luckily, the Nazis didn't understand the potential. Right? So they never used it for encryption, which might have been catastrophic. Right. So, this is probably the first game you can call an AI game. What you see here. It's a game of checkers. It's created by Christopher Stracey in 1951. Okay, it ran out of memory in the computer in 1951, but he ported it to a different computer, so it was really running in 1952. That's how long ago. Right? So, and he also created something like a Mad Libs on the computer for creating love poems. He was also gay. Not the easiest position to be in. And he was actually a classmate of Alan Turing. Right? So it's also sort of a heteronormative expression or critique of heteronormative expressions of love. So that's what we need to think, 1952. Right? That's sort of the starting point. And of course, and this is why Zuse was a number of years off, right? Because it was only in 1997 and not in 1988, as Zuse had predicted, that Deep Blue beat Yuri Kasparov, right? So AI had, from the very beginning, a connection to games. Right, a connection making games or having an AI sort of counterpart to play with, but also seeing AI or seeing games as an important benchmark, right? Beating first chess in 1997 and then Go in 2015. So Go has a much wider space to explore possibilities, and that's why it took so much longer. Okay, if we go into AI and games, and these are just some examples, and here, here are some examples also out of my direct sort of field that I work with, narrative focus. So yeah, 1966, Eliza, Victoria already mentioned it. If we talk about story generation, as we saw, the love letter generator is from 51. And there's some other, there's evidence of other systems from like 1960, 61. Right, so that also goes way back. But then, of course, milestones was Facade. Anybody here has played Facade? Okay, try to find it. Right, I think there's a version that you can play. I mean, it came out in 2005, was actually produced down the road here at Georgia Tech by Michael Matthias and Andrew Stern. And you are, well, in the apartment of a couple who's fighting, and you try to get them to understand that, their marriage will break apart if we don't do anything, and they should probably have a couples therapy, right? But you interact with them through free-form text, So it's natural language processing, which maps it to the behavior of the two characters. And you can actually get them to agree to a therapy. Right? And that is 20 years ago. Right? Unfortunately, Michael Matthias didn't really follow up, or not directly, but I mean, when his students built Prom Week, which you see here in 2012, which is sort of a simulation of a whole class of students, and you're trying to find somebody in 1 week to go to prom with you. Right? Yeah, maybe not happening, but yes, I see. Okay, but I mean, I think many here can sympathize with the stress of this situation. So it's sort of a social simulation. Right, but there's other things, right? Procedural content generation, and somebody here already mentioned Rogue, right? To which all the roguelikes, of course, trace back to. That was in 1980. Actually, A la Kabef was a little earlier, but same year. Right? Then, of course, we have things like Diablo, a really breakthrough game in many ways. We have Dwarf Fortress in 2006 and No Man's Sky in 2016. And yes, I know when it came out, it was terrible, and it took many years, to make it a good game. I think it sort of became one eventually, but the idea is it can procedurally generate the planets you're flying to. And its system can create 14 trillion planets, right? I mean, my esteemed colleague Kate Compton said, yeah, I can also make 14 trillion bowls of porridge, and they will not be meaningfully different, right? And that was unfortunately true when No Man's Sky came out. The planets were not meaningfully different, but that has been considerably improved, right? But it showed the potential of procedural generation. Right, another example is of course pathfinding, right? And pathfinding, I mean, maybe the first famous example is Tactics, and I think that's the wrong image that I have here, sorry for that. Made by Chris Crawford, who wrote extensively in The Art of Game Design about it. Robert Odyssey in 1984, and then we have with Diablo and the Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall, we have the A-star pathfinding algorithm, which is was much improved, right? Another example is finite state machines, right? Finite state machines being used to have, in a sense, more intelligence, reactive enemies, to be able to have something like, a baseball coach that responds, and a whole team that responds to you, and of course real-time strategy games. Herzog 2 from 1989 might be the first example of that one. Okay, and then of course neural networks, and that took a while until that was kind of successfully implemented, but we could probably say that Creatures from 1996 is the first successful example here, right, of having virtual creatures that you can attend to. So overall we can say what were the use cases in AI in games? Well, playing games, as I mentioned, was already there from the beginning of AI, procedural generation, intelligent functions within games, and then, of course, game testing. And here there are very good examples recently. For example, Moodle AI, somebody also there. Some game researchers are directly involved. This is a company that includes Julian Togelius, a big name in game AI. And of course these things can basically automate game testing, right? Do the bug hunting for you, find out what the problems are, and also provide sort of virtual co-players, right? Okay, so then what's actually new with generative AI? Since we've seen that, AI has been used for such a long time. And I think it's a number of things, right? I mean, it's concept art and 2D assets, right? I mean, this is something that I quickly produced with ChatGPT. You know, give me a mood board for a game that will be about Phoenician seafarers, make it mostly green and brown. Bang, there I am. I have a mood board. And the other thing was, you know, give me a background for a side scroller. Yeah, there we go. Another thing, dialogue trees. Right, this is output from Claude. Specified, produce a dialogue tree between the interactor and NPC, who is a janissary in 1560 about his allegiance to the Ottoman ruler. Depending on the choices, the interactor might be taken prisoner for being disloyal, might be invited to join the janissaries, or convince the NPC to betray his cause. So such things can now easily be produced by generative AI. Also, simple 3D models and textures. Right? A cute tiger character, big eyes. Bang. Is it good enough? Of course, that is still a question, right? But we'll come to that. Right? Or we can have whole code generation and review. Here are two examples of games that it just made. I didn't write a single line of code, but they run. Right? What you see to the right was basically a task for Claude, create a text adventure with certain parameters, write the Python code for it, bang, it was there, it runs. Right? It doesn't crash. And what you see to the left is v0def, and where I said, okay, create a library game in the style of restaurant management games, where you have an incoming flow of books, an outgoing flow of books which you need to manage, and at the same time patrons ask you questions, and you need to manage all of that and make sure, and you lose when it piles up. Right? Took like 3 minutes to produce. It runs. So this is where we are now. Right? And of course, oops. Okay. Right. Background music. Right? Can probably be used in a game depending on the need, right? But I just described that. Bang, it was there. Right? And you haven't tried Sumo, you should. It's amazing. And another thing that I tried, just out of curiosity, criticism for game ideas. Right? So, is it a good idea to create a game about the slave trade which includes a mini game of slave Tetris? Right? And if you think this is absolutely horrendous, it is, but actually that game exists. You can Google it. Right? And I mean, of course, the developers argued it really shows how horrendous the whole thing was, because literally human beings were stuffed into and packed as tightly as possible in the ship's hull. Right? So we had an argument for it. We said, no, we really want to show how horrible this is. Right? But I mean, the backlash was considerable. And the game was taken down after a short while. And I mean, so I found it interesting to see what ChatGPT would say, and basically says, okay, this is a terrible idea. Right? So, I mean, I actually initially expected to fail in terms of game idea criticism, but I tried a couple other things and it did pretty well. Right? So if you need somebody to bounce back idea with, it doesn't do horrible. So, with all of that, everything will be AI, right? No need for game developers anymore, and now I drop the mic and run out. Right? Well, okay. I think it's absolutely crucial to understand the limitations of generative AI tools. Right? And also to understand this. These current generative AI tools, they are not creative by itself. What you see is the remediated, the resampled creativity of millions of people before you, whose creativity has been harvested. You know, starting from the cave paintings to, the Mona Lisa, to Dürer's hair, to Van Gogh, to whatever. It's all in there, right? It's sort of amplified, repurposed, remixed, sampled, right? We all remember, when sampling was a big thing, there were copyright lawsuits between different musicians. Oh, you sampled 20 seconds of my music, is this allowed? It's a bit like that. It's not creative by itself. It's a fantastic pattern matching algorithm. That's what it does. It looks at what you wrote in the prompt and then tries to pattern match something to it. I mean, the beginning of all these LLMs is predicting the next word. That's underneath it. You write a word and it tries to predict what would be the next word so it makes sense by looking into billions of texts before. So I think that's important to realize that generative AI might look so strong and good because it sits on all of that. On what many, many generations have done before us. Right? But it also should be clear that generative AI tools repeat and amplify the limitations and the biases of data sets. Right? So I actually spoke at a library event yesterday at the University of Miami. And so, I made some prompts regarding librarians, right? So librarians as magicians of knowledge. Why is that a man? Right? And when I put a similar thing not only to ChatGPT but also to Stable Diffusion, of course also a man. Right? Only when I put in modern day became it a woman. Right? And frankly incompetent model, okay, when I get a woman here, with, of course she's multitasking, so I'm fine actually with the, several arms. Right? I mean, that brings across the message that I wanted to get across here. Right? But it was also interesting, we looked at a number of pictures, and my host there, his partner is blonde, and she looked at all of that and said, yeah, no blonde librarian. We blondes are too stupid. Right? So, I mean, that's also a part of this whole bias thing. Right? And, I never got to that without explicitly saying non-white. Right? I had to explicitly put that in there. And then, of course, it didn't result in an Asian person or in a Latino person. Right? So is this algorithmic bias? I would actually say no, it's not algorithmic bias. It's dataset bias. I think algorithmic bias is a bit overrated. The algorithm just uses whatever's in the data set. Right? And we might remember these horrific things like 5-6 years ago when African American women were recognized as monkeys. Right? By AI algorithms. And why was that? Because there were just no African American women in the freaking data set. Right? So, being aware of that and improving the data set is something we still absolutely have to do. Right? And we can see that everywhere. Again, I work a lot of interactive narrative, right? Every couple number of years comes this like, oh, AI has identified the 8 universal narrative structures. And I'm like, yeah, because we use Project Gutenberg for the data as the data source, which includes basically no African oral storytelling, no Aztec storytelling, no Aboriginal storytelling, hardly anything from China. Yeah, right? There is no universal story structure. There is a myth created by Joseph Campbell, and it's just not true, right? And actually, in the field that he comes from, myth and folklore studies, nobody's using that anymore. Unfortunately, it's still considered the gold standards in many game design studios, right? But again, not algorithmic bias when we see such things like with 8 universal plot types, dataset bias, right? And that's still something to work on, be aware of. Right, and of course, the copyright question is unsolved. There are a number of lawsuits still going on between writers, between musicians, and other creatives and the big AI companies, right? And recently came out that a company called Meta, who makes no money, I guess, probably they don't pay taxes or so, they mined scientific papers from a scientific pirate site called Sci-Hub, right? With no permission. And some academics were fine with that, and of course we can discuss is it fine that journals charge, and I mean that's a different kind of question. But outright stealing is another thing. Right? There was an article in Wired, and when they produced a nice little prompt where they could show, is my work in this pirated collection? And some colleagues were like, yes, great, I will be part of this data set, right? Yeah. So something needs to be done about this issue. One suggestion is to create sort of trade unions. So the idea of data unions has been proposed. Right? And of course, that would also apply to game design. Right? So, and of course, I would say if you're a game designer, consider having a clause in your contract if you do not want your work to be harvested for AI. Actually, the last actor strike, remember, was not so long ago, right? Was all about that. Right? And if you're in the Actors Guild, you now have clauses about that in your contract. So we cannot simply make a 5-minute shoot of you and then use you forever. Because technically that's possible. Right? And also that means the job of a stand-in is gone. There's no need for a stand-in. Right? We just put Ryan Gosling from our AI archive in there when he walks away, and we don't need to see his face. Right? That's where we are. Right. And here's another thing. Generative AI output is mostly not production ready at this moment. One issue with, that's of course good news for game designers. It's also bad news for game designers, because do every, AAA company boss understand that? Or are they just firing people already, even though the technology isn't completely there yet? I know the story of a Swedish game studio that fired 40% of its workforce because of generative AI. Did it turn out well for them? Other question. Right? So, but how can I say this? Well, because I did some research on it. Right? So, I'm not just claiming that. Right? This is something that Victoria was there at the conference, that we published in December, so together with Miriam Palasari-Elatari and Jonathan Barbara, we looked at specifically interactive narratives, so narrative-focused games. And I'll tell you a little bit about our approach, right? So we took a grounded approach, and we invited a number of game designers or narrative designers to work with us to provide feedback. And then we identified a number of common tasks in narrative game design and created prompts for them, worked over, made an iteration on the prompts, then created a whole spec sheet, and we see that as the beginning of a benchmarking framework, and we plan to update it. So, I mean, way too much material to present, but there's a big archive with 248 outputs, so you can look at it yourself. Here are some examples of the outputs. And I don't really think I have time to go into that, but some things were rather convincing and interesting that came out of it, but most of the stuff was not really, in the strictest sense, production ready. And in particular, it struggled with creating anything that was truly interactive when it came to narrative. It made convincing storylines, but when we asked it to have important branching points that really went into interestingly different directions, there was a real struggle. So GenAI can't do interactive narrative for the most part. And we had the results evaluated again by industry experts, not only by us, by practicing game designers. Michael Anderson works at Paradox Interactive. Frederick Serafina, Square Enix. Emily Short is I think, a very well-known independent in that field, right? And but she says, for example, mostly that these things maybe can use for training, for ideation and training, but are not production ready, and that is kind of like, you know, what all of these game designers said. Too verbose for direct use in production, for example, right? A bit underdeveloped, you know, I could use that as inspiration, right? So this is kind of what we see from here. Of course, you can read more in the whole paper. But in order to get to this detailed understanding, we had to create a benchmarking framework, right? And that was important because there isn't any, right? So when you look at generative AIs, there are benchmarking frameworks for them, but none of them are about, let's say, narrative design or game design. And they look like that, right? And they allow, you know, a computer science expert to say, oh, you know, this is Deepseek in comparison to OpenAI, and okay, right? So what I'm basically suggesting here is that we need something like that for games, right? And I'm very happy to announce that Artin and Hefka are working together to create such a thing, right? And we hope, I mean, it will, you know, the starting point was this paper that I already showed, and I will hope we have more this summer, and that's what we are kind of doing right now. And of course, I'm more than happy to have more industry input on this whole process. But I think that would really help to have something that allows us to look at things. Oh, I need generative AI for, I don't know, advanced pathfinding. What is good at that, right? Okay. We should also be very much aware of the limitations and ethical considerations. Here was some reactions that I got when I posted our questionnaire from this effort. Oh, I need more than 1 minute to finish this. Sorry, not going to happen. Right? So, I mean, I was basically thrown out of a Facebook group because of that. Right? Or basically, I had to try to take it down. And, oh, you're not going to help us to make us redundant. I'm like, I'm trying to understand that. I'm an academic. Okay, so, but I think it's understand the capabilities, limitations, ethical problems of GenAI is crucial. Right? And of course, you know, if you haven't been on Hugging Face, you should be on Hugging Face. Right? Hugging Face, if you don't know, is a wonderful platform to compare different generative AI tools. Right? I mean, you find Deepseek there, you find Llama there, we're all there. And with different applications. So it's a one place shop for trying out a lot of things. And I mean, in a recent conversation I was on that topic, I mean, this was a sentence that stuck with me. You will not be replaced by AI, but you might be replaced by somebody who knows AI better than you. right? So that should really be, I think, what most game designers should think about, right? Okay, thinking outside the box. I think we should all start thinking differently about games, right? The current generation is a paradigm shift for games. And what could that mean? Well, I mean, two things, again, out of academia, how to think about it. One is system building, right? And this is a paper I wrote with Miriam in 2021. Game system building, a creative artistic practice which foregrounds the consideration of complex and often unpredictable behavior that emerges out of the intricate combinatorics of dynamic systems with players' interactions. Right? So, I mean, of course, there's a whole paper about it, but we feel that current game design still embodies what we understand as mechanical thinking. Right? What comes out is the sum of its parts. And it's also embedded in frameworks like MDA and many production processes, right? But when we embrace systemic thinking, we embrace unpredictability, because that's a fundamental element of practice, the practice of building non-zero-sum games, right? So again, mechanical thinking is the sum of its parts. But system thinking more than the sum of its parts because of these unpredictable things that might arise. And that's what we get, and that's what we need to embrace, right? And, you know, this is what ChatGPT thinks this means. But, yeah, I will chip over that, but basically it's thinking about architectures, about generation, and about participation and performance. There's more about that in this paper. And another way to think about it, and that's from the PhD thesis that was just defended, is sort of paradigm of neuro game design, right? And Frederick says here, a future where games are not only played, but also involved and co-created with their users in intelligent algorithms. And that embraces non-humancy as a foundational element of game design, advancing emergent gameplay as a key design paradigm and exploring the integration of effective resonance in AI-driven systems, right? And that's his PhD thesis, right? So what types of new games could come out of that, right? I think it's games that use AI as a material for co-creation. For example, NPCs with complex personality traits and emotions which can turn into long-term friends or enemies, right? The NPC that talks back, right? The NPC that has breakdowns and you need to think, what do I do as a friend, right? So much, much broader characters, right? But also player characters with complex personality traits that might sometimes be unable to control themselves. Oh, I shouldn't have done that, but, right? And develop in unexpected ways. Or environment which can change in profound and unexpected ways. So think sim-type games and real-time strategy games, but on steroids. Right? Where many more things change than just, you know, building a house and having an income or something. And, for example, also narrative-based games which can adjust to different culture story structures on the fly. For example, Kisho Tenketsu, a Japanese story structure that doesn't have a climax, that doesn't have the tension build up, that has a twist and then an explanation how the unexpected twist still fits the rest of the story. Or many other cultural story structures, essentially where every tribe in the world has a story structure when you start looking. There is really no universality in this, and we could build games that adjust, that says, oh, I want to see that in a Namibian or African oral storytelling way, or as a Bengali witness video narrative. Right. Of course, also games that learn what the player likes and adjust accordingly in much deeper ways than so far. And another thing that I find interesting, I mean, of course, there's a potential that game production becomes cheaper than it is right now. Right? And that also means games for smaller occasions, a game for a wedding, a game for an anniversary. So there is opportunity here, right? Whatever you can come up with. So wrapping up, AI is a creative opportunity. Again, as a reminder, video games and AI have been connected since the start of computation. And the current generation of generative AI makes AI advances accessible and enables exciting new games with deeper player agency and personalization, greater emotional palette, and dynamic developments. So this is the opportunity, right? Or as a graphic. And I think these opportunities require a rethinking of game design approaches from mechanical thinking to system building and neurodesign. But let's not forget there also come considerable responsibilities in terms of the potential for eliminating jobs, in terms of bias in data sets, and regarding copyright. And that requires a community effort to address. And I think for game developers, it's time to embrace the new tools and create novel, amazing games which represent our complex reality. Well, prop for my book if you want to know more about thinking differently about narrative in games. And that's it. Thank you. Questions? Can I just, how about if I bring the mic to the question? I mean, it's a wireless mic, right?
No, thank you so much. And I really appreciate the connections to systems thinking. And I'm more gravitate towards, because I'm an evaluator, so from the evaluative thinking perspective, curious as to the principles that are guiding your evaluation framework. Thank you.
Evaluation frameworks. Well, I mean, it was really a grounded approach, right? We really thought, okay, what do narrative designers in our case really need, right? And when we came up with a list of ourselves, and when we sent the list to our focus group of practicing narrative designers, and we mostly said okay, but then in the end we ended up with 3 more tasks. So yeah, it's organically built up from the ground.
How are you accounting for culture and context with that grounded approach? I think that's where the heart of my question is.
We're not there yet, right? It's something we need to do. I mean, of course, if you look into my earlier work, you will see that I've spent quite a bit of time on thinking about what I mentioned, narrative structures in different cultures, right? And of which are plenty, and there's actually not enough work done on that. For example, one of my dreams would be an army of PhD students in Africa actually giving us these structures. Because what we have when it comes to African oral storytelling, we have collections, we have recordings, but we have no structural descriptions that a designer could simply implement. And when you start digging, it's difficult to find. Right? So there's ample opportunity for that, and I mean, I have a paper, if you want to look it up under my name from 2018, the Myth of Universal Story Structure, and that I wrote with 4 master students, and I gave all of these master students a different geographic region, and we all found easily many structures, and some of them you see there. Right?